Wow, I love this. It's like a red button saying you're live.
Here
So
we
we're
are.
live. Thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm sure people are still trickling in, so we'll give it a couple of seconds before we kick it off. But notice there is a section to ask questions. So reminder, you don't have to wait until the very end to start asking questions. Just pop in, ask questions. I'll try to do my best to keep an eye on it and ask our amazing speakers. But with that, I'll kick it off with intros. My name is Tigran Sloyan. I'm the co-founder CEO of Code Signal and the founder of the Go Beyond Resumes movement. And I'm super excited to have two amazing guests joining me today. I will not do your intros. I'll let you guys handle it. Craig, take it away.
Great. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Thanks for taking the time to join. Craig Campbell here. I head up tech recruiting at Robinhood with a specific emphasis on engineering and security. Looking forward to what I think will be a very spirited, rich in conversation. Thanks.
Love it. Brenna, go for
Hi,
it.
everyone. My name is Brenna Lenoir, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Code Signal. And I've been in demand gen roles and PR and brand roles over the course of my career. And I'm super excited to chat with Craig and Tigran about where there's overlap and what we can learn from each other.
I love it. So, for those who haven't really read the brief of the event or read it a long time ago, I'll give a quick summary. It's very fascinating how similar go-to-market and recruiting functions are to each other. In some ways, go-to-market has matured a little bit more because it's been around for longer. It's become a little bit more data-driven, a little bit more scientific. But I've seen recruiting catching up to that trend very, very, very quickly. And I thought it's going to be very fascinating to look at something like capacity planning, right? Like on the go-to-market side, you're trying to hit a revenue goal, and you're trying to understand, how many leads, how many opportunities, how much pipeline do you need, and what your conversions look like to get there. And the same exact thing happens on the recruitment side. You're trying to hit hiring goals, and you're really trying to plan and understand what do we need to put into this machine to get the output we can get, and how does this machine need to be optimized to be able to produce it. So today I'm going to go back and forth between recruiting and go to market and understand how the best in the business do that on both sides and draw some parallels. So let's kick it off. I guess let's start on the marketing side, Brenna. Like, how do you think about this? How do you think about capacity planning? How do you think about being able to predict what you should do today to get the
Yes.
output you need 6 months to a year from now?
So in a marketing role, particularly if you're in a demand gen role, you were just waiting for that revenue target to land. And the second it does, you race to Excel and you're coming up with, what are all the milestones that you're going to need to hit? What are your conversion ratios between those milestones? What's all the data that you have to inform that so that you can back up from a goal to say, this is the number of qualified opportunities or the number of qualified leads that we need to present. And then what do we need to do to hit that? So from our perspective, it's how many webinars do we need to do? Where do we need to promote certain things? And what often happens is that revenue target takes some time to actually materialize. And you end up having to run to your spreadsheet earlier and model that out. Like, if they tell us it's going to be this is what the process will look like. But we don't really know. So let's go 15% higher, 15% lower, and try to figure it out. And it really becomes some exploration and modeling in Excel, and then taking that to reality and saying, what are the things that we need to put in market to actually hit those targets?
Right. Craig, let's see what it looks like, right? I can already see, copy paste a word in there, here and there, and starts sounding like recruiting. But I'm curious how you think about this.
Yeah, 100%. We've talked about this before, that there are a lot of similarities, and same thing, starting with the end in mind. And how do we work backwards from that with the data that we have? Ideally, it's a historical, trusted data set, more or less. But it does give us the baselines of sort of what it takes to deliver X.
Mhm.
And then starting there, you then start to run these sort of if-then analysis, what-if analysis. And, the needle to thread, right, is sometimes you're dealing with ambiguous information or less than accurate inputs, which set you up for less than accurate outputs. Now, for any of us that work in talent acquisition, and where most of my career has been in tech, you constantly have a press from stakeholders for you to translate ambiguous inputs into very accurate outputs, right? So it's sort of like this dance of like,
we need a little bell to ding for points of alignment. Yes.
Yeah. So, ambiguity in, ambiguity out, but that's not really how the equation ends up. So I really am a huge believer in it because, if for no other reason, I feel like it levels the playing field and you actually are bringing insight to a conversation that otherwise wouldn't exist. And it's one of the ways over time that I think talent acquisition leaders, particularly, and even recruiters, have been able to move away from this order taking, which sometimes is random. I need you to go hire X, like go, versus like, okay, let's take a beat and let's talk about what it's going to require to hire X. And when we talk about what it's going to take, let's sort of align on the fact that this is a team sport. So here's what it's going to take for recruiting. And now let's talk about what it's going to take for your organization, specific to engineering hours, or as we call it, maker hours. So I think it lines up well.
I guess, how do you reduce that ambiguity though, right? I guess, the same thing on the marketing side. You usually say, hey, I need X thousand leads to hit Y in revenue. And the question always becomes, well, what is it going to take? So how do you eliminate some of that ambiguity from the process, Brenna?
Go ahead. So there's a Moneyball quote that I think about a lot when I'm in this Excel land, which is like, I'll paraphrase: we cannot trust the data alone, and we cannot trust our gut alone. It's when you put those things together that you get a really meaningful output. So the really simple answer is, a lot of times you're not going to have good, trusted historical data, either because you haven't been tracking and there's been so many changes in your process that it just doesn't align anymore. And so you can lean into benchmarks. And there's lots of reports, both on the marketing side and the recruiting side, where you can look at the different milestones and the conversion between those. And then it becomes putting the numbers in and saying, does this fundamentally make sense? Like, where does this just, like, I can look at this and know this doesn't make sense. And then digging in and having a conversation. And it's a lot about what Craig said. You don't just put your model together and then that's it. Your model is what gets you to a strategic conversation to say, what's my piece in this? What's your piece in this? Does this data make sense? And if we hit these targets, are we ultimately going to be set up for success?
But I guess, unlike marketing, who usually doesn't depend on some, for example, like an engineering hours to run their funnel through, Craig, you and your team constantly depend on the hiring managers and the business leaders to actually hit those hiring goals. And I know you mentioned that it's a conversation starter. So what is it going to take from you? But how do you get people to really visualize, right? So like the effort necessary in that partnership?
Yeah, you do need sort of an analytics platform to start with. Right now, that can be everything from a well-designed and reliable Google Sheet on up to the platform we use, which is Tableau, right? Which literally visualizes the data for you. But being able to articulate and frame the workflow and the productivity associated with the workflow and the owners of the particular stages of that workflow, I think make it a real life conversation. Here's where we in recruiting hand off to you on the engineering side. And then here's the forecasted productivity associated with this activity, which for us includes kind of a, targeted and actual. target says this will get us to the outcome that we are in pursuit of. And then actual tells us, are we on track? Are we behind? Are we ahead? Does that have anything to do with resourcing? Do we need more resources? Are we not using those resources efficiently when you start to think about conversion ratios? But I think you do have to show that, because people will then do the math. They'll understand the connectivity of that math to a given person that's accountable to a certain set of activities. And then again, right, it does become a toggle, a negotiated toggle. Well, can we dial that up? And what does that do? Can we dial it down? And you come out of there with some level of agreement,
Right.
Once that visualization is aligned upon.
And what kind of conversions are you talking about? Because I know there are many things you can pay attention. Are there some of the fundamental conversions that you focus on the most, or is it got to look at the entire thing?
I think working backwards, right? It starts with, we describe as the OAR, offer accept rate. And then we kind of work backwards from there. Interview to offer ratio, right? The percentage of pass through, right, leading up to that offer accept is another key one. And then time and stage, right? So it's sort of this intersection of productivity and pace, right? And what's optimal. In what we realize in looking at those, what I call these power metrics, if you will, they really carry the story. And that's no discount to all the things that have to happen at the top, in the middle of the funnel, to even put us in, in my sports language, scoring position. Like, right, how do we get in the red zone? There's a lot of first downs and a lot of, yardage gained to get to that point. But really, that's what it's about. So we have a set of power metrics that I called out that we really pay attention to, that'll tell us if we are on target to a forecast that tells us, if you do this consistently, this is the output you can expect.
Right. How is that similar in marketing, Brenna? Is it, and I guess, how is it different? I'll be curious to hear, is there anything that's kind of different, but also I'd love to hear the similarities and what metrics you
Yeah, I think a lot of the similarities is that the first exercise is identifying those key milestones, and then identifying, either an average or a best in class practice of, like, what is the conversion rate between those? And you can kind of run your numbers. And then as you're going through the process, you can look at actuals. What are you actually attaining versus what did you hope you were going to attain? And how do you need to tweak your model or tweak your methods? I did want to come back to something that you said earlier, which is, like, marketing is not reliant on engineering qualifying our leads. Thank God, good on you all that are reliant on that as your internal partner. But I think where there's a ton of similarity, it changes on who you're talking to, is when you go from that model to the actual conversation. We're talking to sales and saying, here's your piece of this. This is the volume, or this is the size of opportunity. Here's probably what you need to have in headcount to be able to process all of that. Like, does that align with what you're thinking? Does that align with your model?
Right.
On the recruiting side, you're having a conversation with your hiring managers or your heads of department to say, our model's showing we need this many hours from you in interview time. Can you commit to that? Because if you can't, we're all going to fail in this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Craig, how is it different between Uber and Robinhood? I mean, both are going through this kind of, you were there when Uber was exploding in growth. And I mean, everybody knows how fast Robinhood is growing today. I'm curious, how is this thing similar, different, and what's changed for you as you've sort of seen it a couple of times already?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities, certainly as it relates to some of the fundamentals we've been talking about so far. I think, Uber's growth trajectory was on a different level for sure. Even in the recognition that Robinhood's is pretty intense and is on a pretty steep trajectory as well. I would say that on the Uber side, it was even more so. And so to the point of ambiguity, that was sort of a daily, weekly thing we had to monitor, because whatever you did at the beginning of the week, because of that hyper growth, it became absolute by the end of the week. So the numbers where you invested time to introduce accuracy was being outpaced by the growth needs, and so there was a certain amount of that was accepted because of the pace, but I think that goes to sort of the culture of that acceptance. Frankly, one of the things that I sometimes find friction in is that what is the culture as relates to sort of speed, ambiguity, accuracy? Is it misaligned where there may be a lack of knowledge around, why that recipe is as it is, or is there more of a fixed mindset that I feel like it should be X and there's not an accounting for this unnatural pace of growth, which it is. It's unnatural, right? Like, and so I think, I think at Robinhood, we are maturing to account for sort of the unnaturalness of our pace as we mature beyond IPO. I think Uber got there as well, but I think I felt like Uber got there a little bit sooner because it was just known that the growth we were experiencing was going to be counter to any fixed thinking as it relates to numbers. So that's a small sort of difference that I would call out.
How do you deal with, I guess, keeping up with that growth in terms of like headcount for your specific team? I'd love to ask Brenna and see what she thinks, and then bring it back to you, Craig. Because similarly, right, when it comes to like, hey, we need to hit very unnatural revenue targets, one of the first questions you're going to ask yourself is like, okay, well, how big should my team be to be able to keep up with this whole thing? So how do you figure that out?
I think I might have said this to you at some point. Like, it's possible to hit any target. It's just, what is the cost to hit that target?
Right.
We don't want to hit a certain target when it costs twice that much to hit it. That's probably like out of order. So it really does become, and I love that you leaned into culture, Craig. It becomes a question of culture. How much are you willing to risk at the price of speed, or how fast do you want to go? Maybe risking that you might get things wrong. And so you can hit reasonably about any target, depending on how quickly you can move, how big the team is, and how much you want to invest in that. And of course, there's some limits. You can't hire 1,000 people tomorrow, but you could say, what would it take to hire 1,000 people in a month? Is it even possible? And if so, what is the company willing to sacrifice to make it happen? Same thing on the closing opportunities. So I think that instead of it being no, the question is, well, how? And is the how even in the realm of reasonable? And what would we do to do it?
Yeah, love that. And I'll start by building on the culture comment again. I always say for any of us, as challenging as it can be at times, particularly with hyper growth companies, these are moonshot companies we work for. Right? It's just a reality. And when I say that, that just means that they've signed up to do something that has never been done. And when you're doing something that's never been done, it's intense. It comes with moonshot intensity. And so when we choose tech, right, and when we choose a moonshot company, we are also choosing that. And so that leads me to the last part of your comment you made, which was, how do we do this? Not like no, or we can't do it. Like that rarely computes in the industry, and certainly for the companies, at least that I've worked at. It's more about like, oh, how would it work and what would it take? right? And if it weren't for, embracing that mentality, half of these companies probably wouldn't exist, frankly, right? And so you have to go in with that energy, that attitude. And it actually, frankly, takes a lot of steam and a lot of stress out of it, if I'm being honest, in terms of my experience. So let's go ahead. Let's lay out what it will take. We start thinking about how to resource a sort of a moonshot ask, if you will. Certainly there's the people. And historically, the kind of productivity we've come to expect and can rely upon from all the players that participate. And now I'm just sort of talking recruitment, whether that's coordination, sourcers, recruiters, and folks that are managing that cohort of people. There's what does it take to ramp those folks, right, to get to that productivity? And when you look at the current state of sustained productivity and what that output is, now how do you scale that? And then it inevitably is going to require some input of technology. Like if you really are still relying 100% on people, on bodies to get to scale, that might be a losing proposition. I mean, it's kind of a both and, but technology has to come into play because humans are only going to be able to do so much. So you need these enablement platforms of technology, right, to relieve the humans to do what they do best and what they can do most consistently. So you have to consider that component. And then, and then you talk about, can I 2x this in order to achieve this outcome? And then you start modeling, on average, hires per resource, or some people will say per recruiter, per sourcer. I think about it in terms of resources because I like to be able to have an option of fungibility between my resources. That's an ideal state. Are my recruiters and sourcers more fungible versus fixed? So I lay out that math. But where I really love to go is what it's going to take for our partners, right? This is what we show up and do all day, every day. So I'm going to give you that scaling solution. And then now I need to have a conversation about how are you going to scale? How, if you have a day job that is engineering, that is making products, right? And we're asking you to sort of participate in a moonshot trajectory. Do you actually have the hours to do that? Or where is your threshold so that we can sort of build this with both of those, all of those constraints and or inputs in mind? Last thing I'll say on that, as you may know, recently, when Richard Cho was here at Robinhood, they acquired Bink, right? Certainly to the chagrin of a lot of of our talent acquisition peers in the market, as Bink is a very reputable RPO or talent acquisition partner. But that was an example of him articulating what it would take with current resources, where that threshold was blocked with the current resources, and then how can we quickly sort of exponentially increase that scale? Well, to your earlier point, here's an option. There's this company, Bink, we could acquire them, and that would accelerate our scale by X. Here's what it's going to cost. The alternative is, option B, whatever that is. So I love that. I really appreciated that. It didn't help me for what I was trying to partner with Bink on, but I really appreciated that because in my mind, I knew that was a proposition that was laid out. This is what it will take to address this moonshot proposition. There needs to be a moonshot decision, right? So that's probably the most recent example here at Robin. It predated me, but I'm certainly continue to reap the benefits of that.
But resourcing, hiring, and planning is one thing. You mentioned ramping the people that you're hiring, right? And I can only imagine 100 plus recruiters influx into a company straight away. I mean, from learning to, pitch the company the way it should be pitched, to learning the processes, to learning the
Yeah.
tools.
Yeah.
How do you even manage that? And have you historically implemented any sort of like a training onboarding programs that
Yeah.
help? Because you're running 1,000 miles an hour, so you're like building the plane and flying the plane at the same time.
I think the first step is sort of identifying and extracting the core and common. What are the core and common and or repeatable activities, right, that may require less nuance? And so our organization and anyone else who's faced with this, and there are many different models, you think about the more generalist aspect of what we do, the roles that fall into that category. And then you have a lane that is more specialized, which is going to require probably in some ways, a more curated approach. And it doesn't mean that the generalist side of the house is just sort of necessarily rinse and repeat, but they are more scalable. So you have to unpack your organization through that lens. And then there's always a core and common layer of activities, ramp activities, onboarding activities that everybody has to acquire to be in a fundamentally sound position. And then you start to see the divergence by, again, the more generalized demand versus specialized demand. And you have to treat each differently. Another double click on that is then sort of the pipeline based approach, where teams are organized not according to, say, a traditional hub or a pod where we're aligned to a stakeholder, like in our organization, payments. We align by back end, front end, infrastructure, et cetera, because then you get hyper focus on those pipelines, those delivery pipelines, that affords you scale as well. So the less you are fixed in these categories, the more opportunity you have for scale. And that's one thing you have to consider, because all recs, as we know, aren't created equal. All of these scenarios aren't created equal. So each time you double click, you're getting more accurate, you're getting more surgical, so that you can deliver on these demands. So that's sort of a framing of how we at least think about it. It's the way we thought about it at Uber as well. And I know a lot of other companies do also. But then back to the analytics, having an engine or a platform that can actually translate that kind of surgical segmentation of your organization into data outputs is certainly important.
And Craig mentioned using like tools and to empower the team to do more, not just throwing bodies at it. And I feel like marketing is, best marketing leaders know how exactly to achieve amazing things with like a very small and mighty team. I'd love to hear from you, Brenna, like what are some of the kind of core principles behind being able to effectively do this? Because you can do it badly too, right? Just go buy a whole bunch of vendors and then just make it worse instead of actually making it better.
Yeah, the tech stack is what people often talk about in marketing. Like, what's your tech stack and what are you using? And there's so many different tools. So having a really smartly built tech stack is incredibly effective. And you need to define what you need and what you're trying to accomplish before you go out and buy a tool. Because it's very easy to just amass tools and then like half use them. And then the burden of optimizing them and managing them makes it really ineffective. But you want to be able to communicate at scale, to communicate value, to communicate very personally. So tools that allow you to do that are really, really impactful. And then I think the other thing is, one of the trends in marketing that I see following to talent acquisition very quickly is marketing can become empowered to deliver even more qualified opportunities or qualified candidates on the talent acquisition side. So what are the tools that allow you to better qualify talent or skill or engagement before it's passed over, so that you aren't at the mercy of how much time another team has, or you have better insight into why was that a quality candidate or a quality opportunity, or why was it not? How can you learn so that you can train your tools to bring you even more quality?
And Craig, I know you're very vocal about this too. Kind of like, all right, we want 1,000 candidates, and we just hired 50 recruiters, so we might be able to like triple that. Are we ready to interview these people? Because I know that's a point of contention that comes up all the time.
Yeah. One of the things we also partner with our engineering stakeholders on is the capacity planning for interviewing, right? Like we have the ability to articulate, in order to deliver X, we forecast that we're going to need X interview hours per week, every week for the next X. Right now, how do we centralize and standardize that? So we have teams that participate in, say, back end interviewing, and that's what they do. Not that they don't participate in other types of engineering, but that is their sole focus that allows it to be really standardized, consistent, predictable to a large extent. Because when you start to cross pollinate these skill profiles and certainly levels, it skews your accuracy. Right. Mainly because all of those things aren't created equal. Right. And what we interview for is very different. So it's really nice when we can surgically segment those from a sourcing standpoint, from an interviewing standpoint, from a closing standpoint, even. It proves to be very helpful. Part of sort of what we've been talking about in the last few minutes as well is I love that as a talent acquisition leader, and I want this for members of my team, to be able to follow an algorithm that says, oh, you want to hire 50, let me talk to you about what that will take. It will require us to achieve a pass-through rate that looks like this, time and stage that looks like that, and I'll require this level of investment in order to get that. If we can say yes to those things as our path forward, then yes, we think we can achieve this. And we'll monitor this, right? Because in real life, we're going to have to toggle the dials on any one of those activities or stages. But being in a position to articulate the algorithm of hiring with that level of confidence, knowing you have the data behind you such that you can say, and we expect we'll deliver this by this date, right? I mean, I don't know if you can ask for more. I don't know anybody in talent acquisition that wouldn't want to be able to articulate that with the confidence that I think, at least at Robinhood, we're mostly positioned to do.
Right. I guess there's a great question in from the audience around like just what metrics do you really focus on, and it's for you, Craig. So curious, I guess, when you think about metrics for your recruiters, metrics for the sourcers, right? Because I've seen organizations do everything from like number of hires to the quality of those hires to number of calls. Like, what do you think makes for a healthy talent acquisition team, especially in engineering, because it's such a competitive market? So you want to be optimizing every little piece of it.
Yeah, I mentioned a couple earlier. At the highest level, we look at offer accept. We look at an NPS rating, which is sort of giving us a sense of our candidate sentiment about us.
So the feedback from the candidate,
correct,
like a post kind of interview survey kind of situation.
Correct. Time to hire is another one, which sort of is the intersection of our final most productive output of offer accepts and the pace in which we deliver on that. That's at the highest level, but then I definitely think there's a double click on that. That is even more meaningful when we start to think about these things filtered by the different pipelines, the different levels. When we keep it at that high level, the risk, right, is that it could be hiding something more important. And when I say more important, it could be a good thing or it could be a negative thing. I've heard the phrase used among sort of the data community of uh, watermelon metrics. And that's like green on the outside, red on the inside, right? And so these power metrics, if you will, if they're too high level, can look very green. And if you start to double or triple click on each of them, you start to see the red. And it's invaluable because it doesn't mean the whole thing is sort of bad, but you might be able to zero in on one component that we need to solve for, kind of the smoking gun, if you will, that will unlock, you know, exponentially more performance in your pipeline. So that's the caveat I would put on it when you start thinking about these top line power metrics. And then, of course, finally, we're going to look at hires, you know, per resource or hires per recruiter.
Craig, one of the things that you and I have talked about around data is setting up the model is like, it's a lot of work and there's some thinking there. But the real thinking comes in when you are trying to figure out where you double click, because data begets more data. Like you could double click forever and you could go granular in every single area. And there's some areas, but that's a fool's errand. More granularity is not going to change the directional decision or the direction that you need. But there are those watermelon metrics where you do need to click a layer deeper. One of the things you've mentioned, Pat, in the past is specialized roles. You know, they may not follow the same metrics that you have for your overall funnel. So that might be an area where it does make sense to dig a layer deeper and get more granular in the metrics.
There's another question that I want to bring up, which is around talent marketing. I mean, it's just slightly like you could say a newer term in this space, but some call it talent branding, some call it talent marketing, others call it employer branding. But I'm curious, I guess, Craig, from your side, like how do you start baking that into your capacity planning, and how much do you rely on, hey, we've got sort of we've got to move up our brand recognition so we get more candidates coming to us, or do we mostly rely on like sourcing and outbounding to drive that process?
I think at worst, we woefully underestimate the value of this stage, if you will. At best, we're superficial about it. That's my opinion, not just Robinhood, but in my experience. And I think the name of the game today is definitely engagement, right? And I think the marketing and or the branding component of that serves as the assets or the proof points that allow you to have a more effective engagement. You know, for anybody who thinks that finding talent that is so publicly available today is a issue, then, I'll definitely send you no less than a half dozen tools that'll make that a whole lot easier. And so I think we've evolved, or we should have, but I don't think it's evolving fast enough to really put a lot more investment in understanding and intelligence about the engagement. I'll give you an example right now from some of the work we're doing specific to the diversity talent community within engineering. We are certainly working on all the fundamentals that will enable us to position ourselves to be more competitive. But like a lot of places, I just feel like we lack intelligence. I think we lack intelligence about our talent communities in general. And this is why you're seeing a growing swell of that function in talent acquisition, which is sort of intelligence. Like, what do we know about this community? Like really know. Like, right, not even just by the numbers, but like the behaviors, the sentiment, right? Have we actually engaged and asked this community what they think about the current state of Robinhood, or fill in the blank with your company? And we wing it. And we treat it very generically. So just how we were talking about the surgical approach to our different pipelines, we should be doing the same at the top of the funnel, and we should arm our sourcers or anybody who's participating in that game engagement with that intelligence. We would never not do that as it relates to the customer. Like never. Like every company, if they have a customer base, I guarantee you they have personas. And behind those personas is intelligence that allow us to engage specifically to the value proposition that's important for that customer. We need to do a much better job, more intentional job, and put more value in that with our candidates. So we're starting to test that with the talent community that is falls in the traditional definition of diversity, you know, African American engineers, women engineers, Latinx engineers, and beyond, so that we can engage intelligently. And I think that's the first step. And when you have such scarce audience, whether that's by skill or by these demographic segments, you don't get too many bites at that apple. But I think we're winging it. I think in a lot of ways we're being generic about it. And the first step is, you know, recognizing that that might not be the most effective approach.
Yeah. Before I ask you, Brenna, about, you know, what can talent marketing learn about from marketing, I want to, since Craig brought up diversity, there's another question that just came in for him specifically around how do you measure if the team and the company are doing well around diversity recruiting? And you just kind of said basically like, hey, do we even understand who we're recruiting? Would you say that's like the primary metric, or is there?
Yeah, I think it starts with, do you understand the sentiment about your company as it relates to this community? Right? Like that's a starting point. Like if that community is like, you guys suck, right? I would never work there. I'm being hyperbolic, but you know, then you should know that. And then right away, you're like, okay, no matter all the mechanics that we think are the right things to do, this talent community shares a bad sentiment about it. So that's sort of number one. I think number two, and this is not sort of perfect science, but there's a lot of really healthy data-driven research that can at least allow us all to just understand what the true opportunity is. And for example, if we said addressable market, that meaning what's available to us, and I know this is very near and dear to sort of marketing, like what is the market opportunity? And if that for African American engineers, particularly to the types of roles that we hire for, is 5%, then that's knowledge of where we start. So it would be, are we meeting or exceeding that addressable market, or are we falling short of that addressable market? And that's not a fixed position. On any given year, any given quarter, you might be more or less, but at least you have your marker, right? And that means that you've given yourself the maximum opportunity for that. And without that, you get a lot of people shooting in the dark, right? Like, oh, well, we set a goal of 30% or 40%. And I know that varies based on the amount of hiring any company does, but you got to start with that baseline. And that's why I think a lot of folks get set up for failure as it relates to this particular talent market, is because we don't start with just decent knowledge about what is truly available. Now, again, engaging and converting that into an employee base, there's a lot of competition. But I would say, assuming I have, you know, an attractive product to work on for engineers, it's a game of engagement. If we got a better, stronger engagement plan and strategy, I think we will win more than we lose.
Absolutely. Going back a little bit, Brenna, I wanted to hear from you. You know, like I said, talent marketing, talent branding is somewhat niche, kind of gradually picking up steam. Anything that you can anticipate that space learning from the best practices in marketing?
I think Craig hit so many of the points on the head, so I'll just build on those. It's fundamentally different motions, you know, branding and marketing, and we kind of use them interchangeably, but branding is, whether it's a marketing motion or a talent marketing motion, like when you go out, do people understand who you are? and what you stand for and what your value is and what your magic is and how you're unique. And do they even know your name? Like step one, do you know your name? And then can they understand about you? The second motion, and one that is equally important, is what Craig talked about personas. So persona marketing is how well do you understand your target? Do you know, there's a term we use, watering holes. Where do they hang out? Where do they get their information? What are their trusted sources? What do they care about? What keeps them up at night? And so you need that, what we would call air cover, to make sure everyone knows your name and it's a trusted brand and a brand that has a lot of value. But you also have to speak uniquely to those communities, and you have to find them and understand them to be able to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, I actually think even on the tool side, right? Like so many of the tools that have been commonplace in marketing are starting to show up on the recruitment side, even on the intelligence side, the thing that Craig, you talked about. I mean, marketers have so many market intelligence tools, like everything from
Too many.
like sentiment measurement to insights to like changed roles companies, right? And I think it's just barely starting to creep into the talent acquisition market, and people are surprised. It's like, wow, this is groundbreaking innovation. I'm like, that's been in marketing for 10 years. We've been doing this.
Yeah, it's long overdue for sure. And I know over the years, there's been flare-ups, positive flare-ups, where you think it's going to take hold, and then it kind of, for whatever reason, I'll tell you what, I believe that particularly in the tech industry, sometimes our appetite and need for speed and scale compromises that particular strategic approach, because it requires a bit more of a curation, right? And sometimes speed and scale has no time for curation, right? So that's one thing that I think works against taking a beat to really get smart about your audience or a priority audience. Not that you couldn't run them in parallel, but I feel like speed and some scale sometimes override that or pushes that back on the shelf for the purposes of delivery. And so we think right now, particularly with the diversity talent community, African American women, Latinx, to start. I don't know how we could position ourselves to be effective without that intelligence.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, there's a question here specifically. I guess I should have anticipated this about assessments. It's a little bit too specific, asking about specific role, but I want to generalize it a little bit. I mean, obviously, I know, Craig, you were one of the key people who helped bring Code Signal to Uber. It was already at Robinhood when you came in. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, kind of, what do you see the role of technical assessments in general as it comes to helping support, engineering recruiting teams and engineering teams to be able to do this faster and better?
I think it does a couple things. One, if I can build on, sort of the framing of our mission, sort of to democratize finance, I think these assessment platforms and tools like yours helps us democratize, assessments, right? If they're done right, everybody, experiences a core and common assessment stage. Certainly, of course, we have to keep that fresh because, eventually that can become stale as well. And there's ways that we know we can do that. So I think that's number one. I think number two is it affords us scale. My earlier comment about the human versus technology, or sort of the balance, right? Because I think we can't disconnect from the technology, and we need to be more of a companion, a humanized companion to that. And so I think we want to be careful, right? That we're like, great, technology is going to take care of that. So I want to be careful we don't over-index on that for the purposes of scale, but it does afford us scale. And then to the return on investment of the engineering hours that at least in our case, we depend on, it uses that time more effectively. So they feel like, most of the conversations that they're now having when they're doing a human, driven assessment or an interview, it feels like there is not a waste of time. I'm talking to the right people as a result of the output of this assessment stage that we're afforded through platforms like yourself.
Yeah. Shifting gears, and as you can tell, I'm in full-on audience question mode. So people are wondering, sort of when it comes to ratio of sourcing versus recruiting, right? Like, and I would actually love to hear sort of the partnership aspect of it there too, because I've seen everything from like sourcers just go get candidates and then just hand it over as soon as the person gets back. I've seen a mode where sourcers actually get on the phone and talk to the candidates, and recruiters take over when it's at the on-site stage. So curious from your perspective, what has worked best, right, in terms of ratio of sourcing staff for your team as well as recruiting, and how does that partnership work well in general?
I am I'm less of a fan of sort of these what can sometimes be these fixed scenarios, sort of like one sourcer to two recruiters. It may end up that way, but I do math as it relates to productivity, right? So when we talk about this, these pass-through productivity in order to achieve an outcome, one of the questions we get to answer is on the sourcing side, right, which we measure sourcers primarily by offer extends, right? Have they done the identification and pre-qualification that will lead to an offer extend? And so we do math that says how many offer extends do we need to get to a particular outcome, whether it's relating to a pipeline or an area of the business. And then that dictates to me how many sourcers we will need as part of the team. And to your point, the ratios may end up, in some 1-2 or otherwise, depending on whether it's the generalist pillar of our work or the specialized. But I firmly rooted in the number of offer extends we need to hit our goal. And then we build our sourcing team accordingly.
Right. All right. Shifting gears again. How do you retain talent for your team, for the recruiting team? Because these days recruiters are more in demand than engineers. This doesn't happen too much, but I'm literally seeing that it's more demand than engineering. So,
wow, let me count the ways that we put our best foot forward to retain. As you said, Tigran, we're in a phase where recruiters are certainly showing up as competitively sought after as our engineers. I think that would be a surprise to anybody, hence the question. But it's a mixed bag. This is the tougher thing as a leader, right? Which is if you feel good about the fact that the team member is connected to the overall mission, in our case, democratizing finance, right? Like that's number one. Like if people are like, I'm not so into that I'm not connected to that, that doesn't move me. I think those people are somewhat always at risk. Let's just put them in the bucket of moderate flight risk, right? Then when you start drilling down into, do I have a career path? Do I feel fairly compensated? Do I feel unencumbered in my ability to do my job at the best of my ability? Do I respect and have a sense of alignment and maybe followership with my manager, right? So all of these factors, one or a convergence of them is the thing we have to thread as leaders. And that's not easy, right? This is why we also really want to try to free leaders up to spend more of their time, not necessarily preventing attrition, but feeding those components that drive attrition. And if I go back to speed and scale and delivery, right? As a manager, you're like, ooh, I got to put these numbers on the board. I got to put these points on the board, which, yes, that is a component. But when we over-index on that, something's going to give. And I feel like sometimes that's the thing that gives. And then that ties to the other factor, which is simply burnout. Like, right, we're in this moment in time on the, within a pandemic and the evolution of this pandemic where people are simply reevaluating, right? And I say reevaluating their deal, but maybe more than that, reevaluating their patience for any of those dimensions that I called out. Whereas in the past, I had more patience for sort of this career path thing or my manager or whatever the case. I now have less patience, and in some cases, I don't have to have the patience, right? Because I have an offer, I have interviews, et cetera, right? Now, this is the first time that that's happened, but to the person asking that question, I felt like that context was valuable because there is not an answer. We are doing all of those things. And I don't mind saying more or less effectively, like, right? It's like, oh, wow, we're doing this really well. Oh, it's like whack-a-mole sometimes, right? We're trying to do all of those things, I guess, is the short answer. But more importantly, I think it's important to unpack it to figure out which of those dimensions are driving the attrition more than others.
Absolutely.
I know that was long-winded. But
no, that totally makes sense.
I'm living it right now. So for any of you folks out there that are getting my people or poaching my people, we're in the fight. We're working, man. We love our folks, and we're trying to do the right thing by way of their needs. And it's the right work, man. It's the right work. It's hard work. And look, even as I joke about that, we're all in that game. I think it just comes with the territory to some extent, but we're in the fight.
Yeah, and I'd love to wrap it up, but I wanted to hear from you, Brenna, too, because I can attest that your team just loves being here, being there, working with you, and you've had amazing retention always. So I'm curious, what's your secret sauce as a leader, as a manager? But we've got to keep it to like 30
I'll
seconds.
throw down the phrase like the paranoid survive. I know every day my team is getting an email or a LinkedIn message from a recruiter, and it takes one bad day. It takes one terrible conversation for them to be like, I'll take that call. And then they get down the path and they have a heart change and they're gone. And so I think it's incumbent upon the manager to be a really good manager. So there's things that are fundamental to how I try to show up for my team, like trust and transparency. I'm going to tell them absolutely everything I can possibly tell them the second I can, because then they feel like they're in the loop. They feel included and they've got the knowledge they need to be good at their job. I'm going to be vulnerable and authentic. I'll call out when I'm bad. I'll call out when I'm having a bad day so that they know it's okay for them to be authentically themselves as well and to make mistakes and to say, I need to take the afternoon off because I feel crummy and I'm really cranky. And that happens to every person.
Yep.
And then I think something that is truly unique and what I look for in everything is, can we have fun? Can we laugh together? Can we just have silly inside jokes and share dumb memes or whatever it is? Like, can we just make sure that we have that camaraderie and that laughter together?
Love it. Awesome. I feel like it's a great note to end it on. Thank you both so much for being here. I've learned a lot myself, and I hope that the people on the call on the other side did too. Thank you for thoughtful questions, and look out for more great content such as this. And remember to have fun. Life is too short. All right.
Exactly.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you, Craig and Tigran.